Today on the GoodViral podcast, we interview Laurel Sutherlin from the Rainforest Action Network, or for short, RAN. RAN leads and collaborates with local Indigenous communities who campaign against many of the world's most powerful corporations and financial institutions, like banks and insurance companies. They hold them accountable for their role in driving deforestation, human rights abuses, and the climate crisis. Laurel has a lifelong history of participating in direct actions against dozens of nefarious targets, and is also an avid outdoors person, naturalist, and birder. Laurel has been with RAN for 10 years, and on this episode, we learned so much about deforestation and the impact banks specifically have on Indigenous communities through their funding activities. Welcome to the GoodViral podcast. When good goes viral, the world gets better.
Today we have a guest from the Rainforest Action Network from ran.org. We have Laurel on with us. The first thing, and where we really like to start, we want to give people a good understanding so that they can understand what it's all about and what the organization is doing, but also where it comes from. So can you tell us sort of the heart and the mission of Rainforest Action Network? What is it all about?
Sure. Well, of course, at this point in history, everything we do is operating in the context of the climate crisis that's rapidly, already underway. And so, the work that we do generally intersects at sort of three main values or three main approaches. The first one is keeping forests standing and understanding that any viable solution to the overall climate crisis is going to have to involve stopping the global deforestation crisis. The other one is keeping fossil fuels in the ground and stopping future fossil fuel expansion. And then tying those together and underpinning it all is supporting Indigenous rights and recognizing that the most efficient and the most effective way to protect biodiversity and to defend against corporate exploitation is to, protect the rights of, and especially the territorial land rights of Indigenous people who have been stewarding their lands for generations.
I think that's all amazing. I was scouring your website earlier and I was just like, this is such a great way to approach the deforestation issue, especially tying to the Indigenous efforts as well. And so can you kind of give us the origin story of RAN and how it all kind of began, 30 plus years ago?
Sure. Well, RAN was one of the pioneering organizations that really took on a markets-based approach to campaigning. So, there's a lot of different ways to seek systemic change, going after, government approaches, social change in different avenues. But RAN has really specialized in following the money and kind of going back up the chain from points of destruction in the landscape or points of exploitation of people and going back to, what are the driving forces behind it? Who are the big corporate players that are driving this destruction. So we try to expose those connections and then run, public-facing campaigns that pressure them to take action. So, 30 some years ago, the very first, campaign was about destruction happening in the Amazon in South America related to beef. And so it was a campaign on Burger King. And so that was, a very specific point of destruction and a very specific company, and it was successful. And then over the years and decades, RAN has sort of broadened out into a more systemic approach of looking at whole sectors and sort of whole commodities rather than, all the time just necessarily. There's unfortunately too many specific fights to try to take them all on one by one. So looking at, what is the business as usual that needs to be interrupted in order for, these injustices and patterns of destruction to be shifted.
Can you give us some ideas about some of the results, or maybe a story specifically about some of the direct impact and results that you're seeing today as a result of the work that you're doing?
Sure. And so, as I mentioned, RAN has two distinct programs, our forest program and our climate and energy program. And our forest program for the past number of years has focused pretty specifically on Indonesia and Southeast Asia, because that's where roughly 85% of the world's palm oil is being produced. And palm oil, has become the world's most widely used vegetable oil, and the demand for that has caused just left a wake of destruction. Unfortunately, palm oil only grows well right around the equator, which happens to be where the most biologically diverse and dense rainforests also grow. And so, and the massive plantations that are required to produce palm oil leaves, a terrible wake of destruction. So, we have worked for many years to sort of bring palm oil out of the shadows, from an obscure issue that folks, most people would never have heard of, into something that has been much more widely recognized as a major problem. And so, over the past decade or so, and certainly not us alone, we work in coalition, with partners and local and regional partners and frontline communities, and then of course also with international coalitions of other organizations. But together we have, achieved hundreds of pledges from major corporations and food brands, by running big campaigns on names like PepsiCo and Unilever and Nestle, to mention a few, to get them to publicly commit to no deforestation, no peatland destruction, and no exploitation policies. Peatland being particularly important because it's extremely carbon-rich landscape that has been destroyed disproportionately for palm oil plantations. So it's amazing that we've achieved all of these public commitments, but the devil is often in the details. And so our work now is really driving the implementation of these commitments, and getting companies that to realize that actually it gets quite messy when you get into digging into supply chains and figuring out how do you follow where when you have palm oil in a candy bar, or 50% of the other packaged goods in a grocery store, to trace that back all the way through the refineries and the shipping ships across the world down to the plantation where it was grown, and then get the transparency you need and the accountability that you need to actually get changes on the ground. So that's where much of our work is right now, and we have seen some really encouraging drops in deforestation levels in some very important places like the Loser ecosystem in northern Sumatra. And that's the millions of acres of gorgeous, lush rainforest. It's the last place in the world that has orangutans and tigers and elephants, and rhinos still living together in one ecosystem. So, we're starting to see that the details get very complex, but, what we're seeing, monitoring programs and, the actual ability of companies to, remove bad actors from their suppliers when they've been identified as not meeting the criteria that the commitments include. So some of that is very encouraging. There's a lot of work to do, especially to make sure that the problems that have plagued a place like Indonesia don't just shift and start to occur in Africa or South America. So that's a reason that we, always demand global policies from companies, rather than just the sort of site specific. So that's been one very encouraging case. And then on the other end of the spectrum, with the other work that we do on fossil fuels, roughly similar, I would say, just a few years ago, banks weren't recognized as major drivers of climate destruction. They kind of hid behind a curtain saying, oh, we're neutral actors, pushing numbers around. And in fact, banks are massive perpetrators of, fossil fuel expansion and climate change. And over the past few years, we've been able to expose that, and really now they're widely recognized as major players in this crisis. And so we're starting to see lots of new initiatives and commitments, and obviously we're nowhere near where we need to be, and it's not happening fast enough. But we are in the realm where they see the writing on the wall and know that they're going to be held accountable and are needing to take real action to address their roles.
What I think is really cool about all the efforts that you just kind of encompassed here between the banks and between what's going on, especially in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and so on, is that, we tend to think of deforestation as, okay, this is what's happening in the rainforest and that's it. And it's not that simple. It's everywhere. As you've been saying, I was looking at your website, and you're providing funding for over 300 frontline communities in nearly 40 different countries and 6 continents. This is a worldwide issue. And as you also mentioned with Indonesia, you have orangutans with rhinoceros and all these different animals. And so there's lots of ripple effects, I'm sure, that happen with these efforts between going towards the banks and also holding accountability with these companies, and then funding the efforts with Indigenous cultures and other partners on the ground. So can you give us an example or two of the ripple effects you're seeing that maybe you guys weren't quite anticipating would occur with the good efforts that you guys are doing?
One of the things that we often face is that we are a relatively small nonprofit, and we are going up against literally the biggest and most powerful corporations on the planet. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar food brands. We're talking about the biggest banks on Wall Street and fossil fuel companies. And so, we often set out not to do what seems feasible, but we set out to do what needs to be done. And that's what, the climate crisis that we're facing now, I think, is where we're at. It needs to be what happens. And so I guess one example that comes to mind is, when a lot of the climate movement in the US started fighting the Keystone XL pipeline many years ago, people said, you're focusing too much on this one issue, and it's an impossible battle. And of course, many, many, many years later, the Keystone Pipeline has still not been built. It was famously, called Game Over, and it was a carbon bomb by some of the head climate scientists at NASA, and it was, meant to bring massive amounts of the dirtiest fossil fuel on Earth, tar sands, oil, into the U.S. And but something that happened, as a result of that fight against Keystone XL, was dubbed the Keystone Effect, and it became all of a sudden, much, much harder to build any pipelines. Pipelines that used to be rubber stamped by the government and just open channels of funding from the banks started to take many years more to get your permits, started to be cost much more to get the insurance, and we started to see this huge slowdown. And I think now what we're seeing across the whole climate movement is this coalescing around an understanding that the actual message is no new fossil fuel expansion, period. That's where we're at. It's not just not just the Arctic. It's not just deep water. It's not just coal. It's not just tar sands. We're already past our carbon budget. We're done. No new, and in some ways, the simplicity and the moral clarity of that messaging is refreshing, even if it is daunting. But so I think, that ripple effect of the slowdown of the machinery of fossil fuel expansion that I think grew out of the real focus and doubling down and cooperation through the movement on a couple key fights has been very encouraging.
With GoodViral, we said, we're thinking, wow, there's so many, so much talk you hear about the Amazon being the lungs of the planet, and all of these things. So we really wanted to look at organizations out there that could really sort of directly speak to something that for many of us is so removed, and that's why we sought out your company, and that's why we're so happy to have you on. And then it was then that I started to sort of learn from the work that you're doing, or sort of think about it in a different way, and realize that of course, really what we're talking about is so important to the whole entire world, but of course, not just that, is that one of the ways that you all have discovered, obviously, to fight the fight is that the land that we're talking about actually really is inhabited by real people, and there are people that are that depend on that. And now, of course, the whole world does, but obviously, by fighting for their territory, their land, you're able to have a much greater impact. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because I think that it's just a different way of thinking, isn't it? When we look at investors of big corporations, or the leaders of those corporations, as really thinking of it as being theirs, right? That to fill their bank accounts, and and I always think about that it seems like we talk about this recently is that when these wealthy people become grandparents, I'm sure that there's guilt that they must feel when their children are faced with some of the results of what their decisions were, And so, can you speak just a little more to that? Because I'm really curious about the indigenous peoples, about their land, how it affects people's lives of real people, basically, who are living in a real place on the planet that is very, very far from Barcelona or New York or Colorado, like where we are. So can you talk about that just a little bit?
I think certainly at Rainforest Action Network, we have recognized from the very beginning that the not just the most ethical, but also the most effective and the most long-lasting way to certainly to preserve forest ecosystems, but really it applies much more broadly, is to defend the rights of the people who have lived there for generations. And that has now started to be, much more formally recognized by many of the world's major bodies. The UN's IPCC reports that have come out in recent years have recognized the central importance of indigenous land rights to preserving. I think it's something on the order of 80% of the world's biodiversity can be found on lands stewarded by indigenous people, even though the percentage of land is, I don't remember, but I think less than 10%. So that alone is a shocking number. And,
yes.
We've seen in places like Indonesia, places like certainly, Ecuador and across the Amazon, where, even when a government declares a national park, very often they don't have the political will or the logistical capacity to actually protect that landscape from wildcat miners or loggers or even sometimes corporate incursion. And so, but if you have an empowered and intact indigenous community who knows the landscape and is defending it, it is far, far, far more likely that land is going to remain protected. And having partnerships with communities and being able to share resources through the movement, so that there's certainly financial resources, but media exposure, legal resources to be able to protect those rights and fight against corporate incursion is an incredibly winning combination. And interestingly, it is certainly absolutely critical in places like Indonesia and places like the Amazon. But just mentioning Colorado, we have been, one of our big fights this past years has been against the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, not that far from Colorado. And you have major indigenous rights violations happening against treaty lands of the Anishinaabe people. They're in the Midwest of the United States. And we saw this with the Dakota Access Pipeline, in Standing Rock, where we've started to see, these powerful indigenous-led fights against fossil fuel infrastructure right here in the United States. And so that's a really important development that I'm quite certain will continue. We have in British Columbia, major fights against the Coastal GasLink pipeline being led by the Wet'suwet'en and other folks up there. So, as much as the big green movement and the climate movement can follow that indigenous leadership and form meaningful alliances and have solidarity, the better it will be for us all.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And, I think it's great that you're partnering with groups and with indigenous cultures on the ground because of these efforts. And the reason why I say that is because of the lack of history with accountability with other organizations going in kind of with a bulldozer mentality and doing their efforts and then pretty much leaving and just kind of saying it will work, but it doesn't. And we've seen this time and time again with huge concerts with huge celebrities raising so many funds to go and do these efforts. But the accountability of follow through has not occurred. And therefore, it was, in a sense, a wasted effort to a degree. And so I think it's great that you're partnering and you have, in a sense, the foundational groups on the ground, literally fulfilling this and helping it move forward and hold the accountability. Because, as we saw, you're helping 300 different organizations around the world, and something might slip on your end, but you have that tie to hold the accountability. And I think that's absolutely great. So I just wanted to give a big clap and kudos to that. I think that's brilliant of you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I could, I know that you. I don't know the name of the report, but I know that you all just finished a very important report about banking. Can you share with us what that was? You mentioned before about the accountability of the financial institutions, banks, and so forth, and I know that that's a big area of focus. So can you share with us what you've done and where that's going right now?
Sure. Yeah, just a few weeks ago, we released the 13th annual edition of the Banking on Climate Chaos report, which has become the most comprehensive sort of database of fossil fuel financing in the world. And so at this point, looking at following the money again, and looking at who are the biggest financial institutions and banks that are facilitating the fossil fuel industry, and particularly the continued expansion of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so this report has become kind of taken on a life of its own, and it's gotten tremendous international coverage in the world's top financial media, but also has been translated into many languages and become kind of a kernel of support for regional campaigns that are taking on banks, French banks, and Barclays in the UK, the Canadian banks that are funding the tar sands. But here in the United States, the top four, funders of fossil fuel on the planet are all based here in the United States, and so we are seeing a real recognition that fossil fuel infrastructure, if you're going to build a pipeline, or you're going to build a new coal plant or a liquefied natural gas terminal, anything it's going to be, you need three things. You need government permits, you need big bank financing, and you need insurance. And so simplifying it in that degree sort of shows these Achilles heels. And so looking at the responsibility that these banks have, they're making a choice when they shovel these tens of billions of dollars into fossil fuels.
That's right.
They don't have to do that. They have made decisions around tobacco, around weapons manufacturers before. It's a very clear choice. They're not bound to these things. And for instance, JP Morgan Chase, which is the biggest funder of fossil fuels on the planet, I think that, but even them, it's something on the order of 7% of their total output, their total, money that they're is in fossil fuels. So it's not an existential issue for them to just say, we're not going to do this. They would be just fine. They would still be probably the wealthiest bank on the planet if they stopped funding fossil fuels. So, this was a recognition years ago that going after an Exxon or a Chevron directly is little bit like banging your head against a wall, because they are what they are. But following the money and turning off the spigot of funds can be an incredibly effective means of shifting sort of the global economy away from dependence on fossil fuels. So we are, we author this report in partnership with a number of other organizations across the United States and across Europe. And at this point, are excited to work with. Also, there's a new and exciting coalition. It's a couple of years old now, called Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, which has grown to be over 200 organizations are part of it. And it focuses not just on banks, but also giant asset managers and also insurers. And so we work very closely with them to take the big kind of wonky data dump of the Banking on Climate Chaos report and turn it into building people-powered movements that can effectively pressure these major financial institutions, into action. So it feels like it's daunting, but it is the terrain and is shifting, and the global narrative is shifting quite significantly and quite quickly. And actually, just this next week, three of the biggest funders of fossil fuel in the world, Citibank, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, all have their annual general meetings. Chase will be next month, other banks in this season as well. And across the board, for the first time ever, all of them are facing shareholder resolutions that would calling on them to stop financing fossil fuels. So
Wow.
we're seeing, a real inside outside kind of thing happening, where there will be people in the streets. We have scientists, climate scientists locking down to bank branches. We have movements rising up, across the country and across the world in the streets. But we also have, increasingly sort of this taking it to the boardroom and investor approaches as well. So I think there's a building momentum that actually has the power to start to influence these massively powerful companies and
Right.
banks.
I love it. That's amazing news. Yeah, so exciting to hear that. That's great. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because Damien and I, we interviewed in one of our past episodes, I believe it's releasing this week, is Charity Watch. And Charity Watch is kind of like the watchdog of at least American or United States-based charities, looking into their financial records, seeing where the money is going. And so I kind of find it really cool that you're also, in a sense, doing a lot of that. You're looking at where's the money going and really bringing that to the surface and to the topic of conversation. And I think that is absolutely fantastic. And I haven't heard of a lot of, I guess you could say, nonprofits or charities or even organizations that are doing good causes that are really pushing that so hard. And I think that's so great that you guys are involved in that with the banking system specifically. That's, like you said, you're a small organization going to these huge megalithic type of companies. And to bring this to the boardrooms is fantastic. And it sounds like what communication you and your efforts across the world has finally reached the ears of those who are not willing usually to listen. And so I just kind of want to give another kudos to that the efforts are definitely, that I'm hearing, we're hard, and hopefully they will now this year, it sounds like, be very fruitful. And so just another big applause to you guys for all of that. That's amazing.
Well, thank you. And yeah, and it's interesting because we're at the point now where we've gone from, being ignored to being sort of acknowledged and placated. So, we had, it's definitely a sign of progress, but we also are experiencing some very sophisticated greenwash at this point, where banks are falling all over themselves to make net zero commitments by 2050, or to talk about they're going to focus on carbon intensity, or all these kind of corporate doublespeak jargony words that anything to sound like they're doing something without actually having to do something that they don't want to do or might be hard. And so it's a little bit of an arms race of rhetoric and research to be able to call them out and let people know this isn't as it seems. But one thing we found with the banks, at least in the US, is they really tend to operate in lockstep. So they none of them want to go put their neck out as and be a real leader, but none of them want to be left behind either. And so the result of that is it can be very hard to achieve change. You push and push and push and push, and you're not getting anything. But then one of them breaks, and then the whole pack quickly follows. And we've seen that play out with coal policies, with Arctic policies, and hopeful that can play out in some much more significant ways with fossil fuels overall. But they tend to move as a pack.
That's really interesting. You say that, and I imagine, this fantasy of old men sitting around with cigars, all, 5 guys making that decision all at once, So, but that's very interesting. As you mentioned, the greenwashing. I mean, it's at least it's an indicator of a step in the right direction, of a change, And I feel like it's interesting because in this interview, maybe more than any other that we've done, I feel like this is just that you all are really at the heart of maybe one of the most important things that we as a human race need to be focusing on to save this earth, just this planet. And so I love the work that you all are doing. I love the way that you're going about it. And I hope that it's, I know that it's inspiring our listeners as it is me with the progress that you're doing. Our mission, our objective is that every person, regardless of whether they are involved directly in a nonprofit organization, or if they're working for a very, very money-hungry corporation, no matter who that person is, all people can make changes in their decisions and in their lives that can affect the results of what will be, future generations, or even our own planet as we become older, right? So besides, I want to ask you all, so besides the obvious of donating money, which is what probably some of our listeners are already planning to do anyway, which they can, I believe, reach, go directly to RAN.org, RAN.org, which is the Rainforest Action Network. But besides doing that, what are some of the maybe one or two things that people can do in their everyday lives that can bring in a great impact to your mission?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, I would say, just quickly to follow, add to, at RAN.org, the first thing is to join us. And by putting an email there, even if you're not able to donate, being on our action alert list, we have amazing campaigners who are looking to identify leverage points where public pressure can create change, and then put out an alert and say, right now, this phone call to this bank, or this petition signing to this food company, or this this action we've identified as a strategic moment for change making. So by getting on that list and participating, that's certainly an easy way and something that we can offer. And I would say, for folks' personal lives, obviously, I think it's wonderful for people to make decisions to switch from one of the big mega banks to a credit union, to stop buying palm oil and look for things without it. But I think the critically important follow through on that is to engage with the company involved and tell them that you've done it, or tell them that you're doing it, because very often it's that a lot of these big companies, they invest millions and millions and millions of dollars in their brand. Their brand is one of their most important things to them. And so creating the reputational risk, or even the illusion of reputational risk for these brands, can really get their attention. So if they are getting a steady growing trickle of posts on social media, emails, phone calls, letters to the editor, all these different channels of communication that are saying, I see what you're doing. I see that you're funding fossil fuels Chase Bank. I see that you're using, conflict palm oil, Nestle. It gets through to them. So I think having that direct communication, if you're going to make these lifestyle choices, to the company so that they see that you're doing it, is really important. And then last thing I guess I would say is, that unfortunately, the way the world is today, there's almost certainly a local fight where you live, whether it's against a new liquefied gas terminal in the Gulf Coast, or against a pipeline in the Midwest, or and so figuring out who are the local nonprofit organizations, who is the Indigenous group that's fighting for their rights, and figuring out how you may be able to contribute. And there's so many ways. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's bodies on the front line, but there's a whole lot more, just as important and less public facing, support roles that a lot of these movements need to be sustained. And so kind of figuring out what that local cause is and what do they need is really important.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Laurel. This has been a fantastic episode, just saying. We learned a lot. I know I did, and I'm sure our listeners did too. Really learning what is going on, not only behind the scenes of deforestation, but what's happening on the ground efforts as well. And for all of those who are listening, please go and follow Rainforest Network on Instagram and Facebook. Check out their efforts on there. They're always posting things, and especially their website, ran.org. You can see all of their efforts and all kind of like this newsletter, and especially the action newsletter that you're talking about. Please join that for sure. So thank you so much, Laura, for being on the GoodViral podcast. We are excited to continue this relationship with you and to see and support all of the efforts that you and the RAN Network are putting out there, especially in this next year. We're really excited.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the GoodViral podcast and being part of a conversation. If you are inspired by this episode, go to our website at goodviral.org, where you can find resources and listings from the episode to continue good efforts.
Like, comment, and share this episode to any or all of your social media channels. It's really easy to take a small action, and maybe you'll inspire a big result.
When good goes viral, the world gets better.